Hi everyone, I'm Renee Hiatt, a Sew on the Go. I'm back for my week 2 of my Tutorial Tuesdays. Thank you for tuning in again. We are going to continue for the next 7 weeks talking about my pattern Bloom. For it you will need the pattern, which you can purchase from my shop, sewonthego.net. Just click on the shop button. You will also need the Studio 180 Square Squared and the Studio 180 V-Block. Today we're going to talk about preparing your fabric and cutting. We're going to go through some tips and tricks on improving your pressing technique as well as improving your cutting technique, and hopefully by the end of today's tutorial you'll be set to go cut your Bloom pattern out, because next week we start piecing, so make sure you get yourself cut this week. So, through my Facebook and Instagram posts, I asked questions pertaining to cutting, and I'm going to incorporate them through the next couple of minutes of going through how to improve your pressing and your ironing. So, the first question came from Jill of New Hampshire, formerly of Connecticut, but she had asked about when she cuts, sometimes things get wonky, and whether or not you should fold once or twice. So it really depends on how well you prepare your fabric, and I'm going to go through some tips on how to do that. So let me get started. So the first thing is you want to get yourself a good iron. I happen to use the Alessos. I also use the Sharks in my retreats. They work fabulously. Basically, it has to work for you. The other thing is I highly recommend a big board, whether or not you purchase one to put on top of your cutting your already existing ironing board, although I find them a little wonky. I also have a freestanding big board that I use in my other studio, which works fabulously. This one here is meant to go on top of a countertop, and my husband just put little rubber feet on it, and it works fantastic. I also highly recommend a wool mat. The thing you need to be careful about with the wool mat is you want the lowest of your steam settings. Some people say you couldn't use steam at all. I happen to use steam, but I use it in very little increments. The other thing I always use is best press, but I put my best press in one of my misters, and this way it just gives a light touch to it. You don't need a lot of best press. The thing about best press is once you apply it, it's good for 2 to 3 irons with mild steam. So in other words, the steam will actually reactivate the best press, which works fantastic. So I really apply my best press when I prepare my fabric, and then I will put my unit together, cut and put my unit together, and then I will apply best press again at the end of the unit before I do my final trim down. Then I'll put my blocks together and then apply more best press, and then I'll put my quilt together and apply best press. So you don't need to apply best press every single time if you're using a steam iron. So your fabric, it comes off the bolt and it's not exactly folded well. And I think that's where a lot of you folks go wrong, is that you assume that you can just maybe tighten up that edge a bit and it's going to be perfect. But it's not. Here's an example of, this is my white on white that I'm going to be using for my remake of my Bloom. And here's the shop's cut. And then you can see when I tore an actual true straight of grain, the differences. So it can be a lot. You could also have a great cut. For instance, this came off of my green. It's pretty close on the mark. But either way, I don't take the chance. So whenever I'm preparing my fabric, I'm going to completely open it up. I'm going to want to get rid of that fold. To start with though, so I'm actually going to take my fabric and I'm going to come in about 3/4 of an inch and make a little nip, and then I'm going to go ahead and find my true straight of grain. I know it scares a lot of you, but it really is what you should do. So not with fat quarters, but with yardage. Anything greater than 1/4 of a yard, I go ahead and find my true straight of grain. So once I have that, I'm then going to open up my fabric and lay it completely flat. And I'm going to apply a light mist of Best Press. And I'm going to press it. And like I said, you don't need a lot of steam. Our goal here is to get out as many of the wrinkles as we can. And it really is to remove the fold that was here when it was on the bolt. So I'm going to move up my fabric and continue on. Ideally, I have a little bit more room. I have my folded fabric here on the edge of the table, causing me a little trauma, but all right, another light mist. And again, the most important crease is that crease down the middle that we're looking to get rid of. You know, what this is doing is giving us a nice, flat, workable space, you know, where we can make our proper cuts without a wrinkle causing us trauma. If you have large yardage, like for instance my background, don't be afraid to break it into two. So for instance, 3.5 yards, I will hunk off about 2 yards, rip and tear, and then I will do this to 2 sets of yardage, one being 2, one being 1.5 yards. So then, once I have this pretty flat, I'm going to then line up my true straight of grain. I know this is straight, so I'm going to use that to set my fold. I'm going to lay that on my mat, my ironing mat, and while keeping this straight, I'm going to get this straight. And then I'm just basically petting it out. You'll notice that the true fold is a smidge off. I also, at this point, apply a little more Best Press, just because I want to make sure that when I press this, that the true fold becomes apparent over the former fold that was on the bolt. All right, so keeping this lined up and this lined up, I'm going to go ahead, and you can see that that true fold was off a smidge. Not much though, actually fairly good. I find actually, you know, the bolts that have more yardage, some bolts come with 15 yards, some bolts come with 10. Usually our blenders come with 15. And those might be ones that are a little more sloppy than the others. So I just moved up what I had. And again, I'm going to leave a little bit on the mat so that I can make sure I'm still lining up with the original fold that I set up there. And again, I'm going to apply a little Best Press on my fold, my new fold. And I'm going to go ahead, and I actually set this side, because this side I know I'm lining up, and then kind of work my way over to here. You'll find that when you're ironing, it actually puts the two pieces of fabric together almost like glue. So it helps keep it together nice and even. All right. Once I'm satisfied with that, notice this line does not line up because this I did not set the true straight of grain. I'm going to start my cutting from that side. So therefore, I'm going to take one of my long rulers and I'm going to use that to get it into a nice even stack. So I just bring it back. And pretty much I do this with anything that's a ½ yard or more. Once you get that set, then you can go ahead and pull out your long ruler and put it back. And then you'll have, if you do that for all of your long yardage, you'll have a nice neat stack. Everything fits well. For the fat quarters, I'm going to do similar in that I'm going to line up basically the full fat quarter on the table or on my pressing mat, and I'm going to apply Best Press, and then I'm going to just give it a nice iron. I'll repeat that for all the fat quarters, lining them up so that they're nice and neat. So you'll see here my fat quarters, and I have 2 in this one. I've just basically pressed out 2 and put them together. So that's how I prepare my fabric. I think it will help you a great deal. One, in putting best press into it to give you some stiffness. You don't want a lot of stiffness, but you want enough stiffness that it keeps you from stretching the fabric in later cuts and presses. And also, it sets the true fold, which when we go to make our cuts in the next segment, we'll be able to line up and actually use that fold because we know that it's the true fold. All right, so just to recap, for your pressing, I take everything that comes off the bolt, I open it up, I find the true straight of grain by doing a little tear and rip, then I press everything open, then I fold it using that true straight of grain, making the true fold, lining up the salvages, going through and pressing, and then I roll it onto a ruler, which puts it in a nice even stack. So I hope that helps a little bit with pressing, and you'll see how that pays off in our next segment with cutting. Okay, let's talk cutting. Before we get started on actually performing the cutting, I want to take you through a few things. First, you need to find the proper place to cut. You should have an area where you're at your natural waist to provide you a good height. If you don't have something like a countertop, which I'm fortunate enough to have, you could, why not use your kitchen countertop as well. But you could also put a table on bed risers. And bed risers come in several different sizes. So you can get ones that are as small as 4 inches or 6 inches or 8 inches. So they do differ in size, and you want to get the size that works for you. So if you're shorter like myself, you probably only need the 4 or the 6 inches. If you're someone taller, you probably want the 8 inches. You basically want to be able to bend at the waist and get your full reach when cutting. Because if we go back to Jill's question, which do you fold once or twice, ideally you fold once. If you feel you need to fold twice, then you of course want to make sure you have that true straight of grain for your first fold. I know some of you sit when you sew or cut. I have never been able to do it. And I do find that people who do sit when they cut, that they have more inconsistency. So I would say if you are able to stand, you should stand when you're cutting, at least for your long runs. If you have to sit, something you should think about is keeping your table the regular height and getting yourself a stool which will bring you up a bit so that basically you are waist high on that table. That will really, really help you a lot. The next thing is tools, and you have to figure out which tools work for you. I absolutely adore the Quilter Select rulers. You definitely want to get yourself at least 2 long rulers, and I'll tell you why in a bit. I have a 6 and an 8.5, which helps me out a great deal. These I like because they have a grippy on the back, which helps me stay straight. Creative Grids has little discs, which also help you stay pretty straight. You want a ruler with some really thin lines. The other advantage to the Quilter Select rulers, which is why I use them, is that they have this light yellow foam, which up against a dark color, especially black, because I use black a lot in my quilts, I can still see the lines. So that's why I love them. There's a ton of rotary cutters out there. Martelli has one which helps you with your wrist. The only thing is that they either come in right or left-handed. Being that I'm mostly left-handed, but I often cut with my right, that's my only downside of the Martelli, and I don't use it as much. If you are newer to cutting, or you're cutting small pieces, the small little 18 millimeter works great, especially if you're doing small points and such. They can still be just as sharp, so still be just as careful with them. You have your 45 and your 60. The ergonomically correct are fabulous. The lockable work great, so especially when you're sewing with others. I myself have moved to the Quilter Select as my favorite rotary cutter. It is heavy, but the weight helps me actually cut. I find myself being able to cut a full-size quilt in a day without my wrist hurting. So while it feels awkward and it is on the more pricier side, it does work for me. Again, you need to find the tools that work for you. There's many on the market. If you go to a quilt show, you go to a quilt shop, a lot of times they'll let you try them, but you really want to find what works for you. Now, another question that came up was on using the lines on the mats. So again, when we get to mats, it's all a matter of opinion. I happen to have loved the Ulto mats because they allowed me to move my fabric easily. Whether or not I'm using the Quilter Select or Invisigrip on the back of my ruler, it allowed me to move the fabric, which I found to be an advantage. So I loved the Ulto mats. Unfortunately, they're no longer in production. I have moved to the Quilter Select mats, which I find work really, really well. I do not use the lines on the mats. I highly recommend that you don't, unless you're literally hunking off some yardage. That's the only time I use the numbers on my mats. Even making a large cut greater than the 8.5 inches, I will take a large square ruler. I have 16 20-inch, and use that along with my long ruler to do my wide cuts. The mats, just think about it. How do they print the lines on these mats? How do they print the lines on the ruler? The ruler is going to be much, much more accurate. So I find that the lines on the mats are helpful when trying to figure out if I have 2.5 yards, but they are not helpful when cutting. So I will use rulers to use for my lines. I think some of you will find that might be why you find some inconsistency when you might cut a 5-inch strip and then when you go to put it on against another ruler and you find it's 4 7/8, which sometimes it will matter. So I'd highly recommend not using the mat. Let's use the rulers for the numbers. So, okay, so I think that about does it on rulers and the proper setup. I want to talk to you next about preparing to cut. I have a method. I use paper plates. It works for me. I'm going to go through it. It's not for everyone. I used to be a Ziploc bag person, but I found that they slipped all over and I couldn't find them, and if they slipped off the table, then I was driving myself crazy trying to figure it out. I also was pinning labels, writing labels, putting post-it notes on. It didn't work for me. I use paper plates, and I'll go through that with you. My patterns, if you're not familiar with them, they're in booklet form. I come from a highly process, a large background in process, working with policies and procedures, working with state regulators, federal regulators, and such. So I think I've become pretty good at writing a decent pattern. I took my quilt knowledge as well as my process and tried to put it into a pattern. So all my patterns are booklets, so you're not losing pages. All of them are quite detailed. They go anywhere from 28 pages to 40 pages. Now they're half pages, but they give you both right and left-hand instructions. Also, my patterns start with a table of contents, and then it goes into a unit and block summary. And in the unit and block summary is where I tell you how many of each block and each unit you're going to need and what it's going to cut at and what it's going to finish at. So remember, cut is the size of the unit before we put it in the quilt, and finished is when it's inside the quilt, so less that 1/4 inch seam. So I do this because I don't know about you, but once I get going and I start making my units, I don't really need to look at the details of the pattern as to how to do it. I want to know how many units do I need and what size are they supposed to be. So that can all be found on your unit and block summary. In this pattern, it's on page 2. And I'll give you a detailed zoom of that in just a sec. Then what I do is I take and create a paper plate for every one of these units. Bloom, you'll notice, has 7 units inside the main quilt. So in each of these, for each of these units, I will go ahead and create a plate that has the quilt I'm working on, the size I'm making, in case I want to reuse these plates to make this quilt again, the unit that I'm making, what the cut size of that unit is, how many are going to be in a block, and how many are going to be in my quilt. Then going to write down when I get over to the cutting section. So for instance, on this V block, when I get over here, I need a V center, which is background, and a side triangles, which are assorted bright fabrics. So I'm going to go ahead and write that on my paper plate and put how much I'm cutting from each, and then what are my subcuts, or what page I'm going to go to for my subcuts. So I basically go through and then create, so for each of these, I'll have my 7 plates with my detail, and then I will go ahead and make the final plates based off of my borders. So any units that I need for the corners or the piano keys or the inner border or even the binding. I happen to cut my quilt all at one time. I find it to be the best method for me. You might find differently, but I cut it all at once. That doesn't mean I go non-stop. I do break for treats, chocolate, and such meals. But I try and cut it all from start to finish before I do any of my actual piecing. So another tool that I use that you can find in my shop is I have paper, sheets of paper that I create for each of my projects, which gives the name, the size, the recipient, my priority. May not be as big a deal for you. It's a big deal for me. I usually have deadlines. At what stage I'm at, whether or not I've gotten the fabric pulled, the pattern read, paper plates made, fabric cut, units made, blocks made, borders made. And then down here, I also give a section on putting your fabric. So in other words, what did the fabric maker call the area? So in other words, accent 1, green. And then what I'm calling it and what my fabric actually is. So you can put swatches of your fabric on here and keep one of these with each of your projects. The tablets, they come in 25 sheets in each tablet, so you can find them in my Etsy shop if that will help you out in keeping yourself organized. So I think we are now ready to actually do some cutting. So I'm going to go ahead and reposition my camera so that you can see me cut. Thank you very much.